Sometimes the deepest wound isn't an illness or the passing of years. It's when the very child you sacrificed everything for looks you in the eye and betrays you. Imagine building a home with your own hands, only to return from the hospital and find strangers inside, laughing where your family once gathered. That kind of pain doesn't just break a man's heart, it tests the very dignity he spent a lifetime holding on to. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And tell me honestly, if you were in my place, what would you do? Your thoughts matter here, because every story like this is also a mirror of the lives we've all lived. Thank you for listening with respect. The ride back from the hospital was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the car engine seemed to echo against my chest, and every bump in the road reminded me how fragile I had become. I held my small bag of clothes on my lap, the same ones I had worn when I was admitted. The smell of antiseptic still clung to them, a faint reminder of sleepless nights under fluorescent lights and the sound of machines that measured each breath I took. I told myself that once I crossed the front gate of my house, once I saw the old porch I had painted so many times, I would feel whole again. Home has a way of stitching broken spirits. At least, that's what I believed. The taxi slowed down and turned onto my street. I pressed my hand against the window, staring at the rows of familiar houses. Children's bicycles leaned against fences. Curtains fluttered in the breeze. Life was carrying on exactly as I had left it. My heart warmed for a moment, but then the car pulled up in front of my gate, and something inside me turned cold. The front door was closed, but not in the welcoming way I remembered. It was locked tight, blinds drawn, as if the house had chosen to shut me out. I stepped out slowly, the air cool against my skin. The small bag in my hand suddenly felt heavier. When I reached the gate, I noticed details I had never seen before. The garden I loved, once carefully trimmed, was overgrown. The path leading to the door had footprints that weren't mine. And then I heard the sound of laughter drifting from inside. Unfamiliar laughter. Not my son's, not my grandson's. Strangers. My hand trembled as I knocked on the door. The laughter stopped. A moment later, a woman I had never seen before opened it halfway. She looked at me with the kind of polite confusion reserved for door-to-door salesmen. "Can I help you?" she asked. Behind her, a man appeared, resting his arm casually against the frame as though he belonged there. He looked me up and down, then said, "Sir, this is our house. Did you get the wrong address?" The words pierced through me. My mouth went dry. This is my home," I managed to whisper, though it sounded more like a plea than a declaration. My eyes darted past them, searching for something familiar inside the old clock on the wall. The family photos, the armchair I used to sit in, but none of it was there. The place looked different, rearranged, like time itself had shifted in my absence. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, I saw him, my son Daniel. He stepped forward slowly, his face stiff, his eyes avoiding mine. For a heartbeat, I thought he would smile, rush forward, embrace me, tell me everything was a mistake. Instead, he stood there, silent, until finally he said, "Dad, you don't live here anymore." The bag slipped slightly from my hand. I wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but the weight of his words pressed down harder than my illness ever had. The strangers at the door, the unfamiliar laughter, the emptiness in his eyes, it all told me one thing. Something had happened while I was gone, something I had never imagined. And as I stood there on the doorstep of the house I had built with my own hands, I realized this was only the beginning of a storm I wasn't ready for. Next came the moment when Daniel finally revealed what he had done and why my name no longer mattered in the place I once called home. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My son's words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating me before I could even find breath. The woman at the door shifted uncomfortably, as if she knew she was standing between a father and a truth no father should ever hear. "I think you should leave now," the man added, his voice firm but uneasy. His hand tightened on the doorframe, guarding the entrance as if I were a stranger trying to force my way in. "Daniel," I said, my voice breaking on his name. "What is going on here?" Who are these people in my house? My eyes searched his face, desperate for the boy I had once carried on my shoulders. The boy who clung to me when storms rattled the windows. All I found was a man with hardened eyes, refusing to meet mine. His silence was louder than any answer. Finally, he stepped closer. His jaw was tight, his shoulders squared as though preparing for a fight. "Dad," he said slowly, "this isn't your house anymore. I sold it." The words slammed into me with the force of a hammer. My chest tightened, my grip on the bag loosening until it nearly slipped to the ground. Sold. He said it so casually, like it was a used car, not the walls that had sheltered us for decades. "You? What?" The whisper came out before I realized I had spoken. My voice trembled with disbelief. "You sold my house while I was in the hospital?" The memories flooded me, long nights laying bricks, saving every dollar to make the mortgage, repainting walls with my wife before she passed. I had poured my life into this place, and he had discarded it like an old coat. Daniel finally looked at me then, and his eyes carried not shame but irritation. "You don't understand. You can't take care of it anymore. You were gone for weeks, and we had bills piling up." It made sense. He gestured behind him at the couple, who stood stiffly, pretending not to listen though their ears strained for every word. "They bought it. It's their home now." My legs trembled beneath me, the world tilted. "Made sense?" I whispered, hardly able to swallow the words. "This was not just a roof, Daniel. This was my life, your childhood, your mother's memory, and you—" My throat caught. "You sold it without even asking me?" His face hardened. "I didn't need to ask. You weren't here, and the house was in my hands. Someone had to make a decision. I did what needed to be done." So, I stared at him, my own son, the boy who once promised to take care of me when I was old. The stranger at the door shuffled his feet, and the woman's eyes darted nervously between us. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of grief and fury swirling inside me. Daniel's words echoed, each one heavier than the last. And in that moment, with strangers standing in my doorway and my son looking at me as if I were an intruder, I realized the betrayal went deeper than just walls and bricks. It was something that could not be undone with money or explanations, something that would demand more than just answers. What Daniel said next would change everything I thought I knew about my own family. The man and woman stepped back, giving space, but I hardly noticed them anymore. All I could see was Daniel. He leaned against the doorframe like he was bracing himself, arms crossed, his face carved into something I didn't recognize. For a moment, I thought he might soften, that he might let the years of shared memories break through that hardened shell. Instead, his lips curled into a thin, almost bitter smile. "You're not listening, Dad," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "The house isn't yours. It's mine to handle now. And I did what I had to do. You should be thanking me for making sure it didn't fall apart while you were laid up in the hospital." His words cut deeper than any illness ever had. I took a step forward, my bag slipping from my shoulder to the ground with a dull thud. "Thanking you?" My voice trembled with disbelief. "You sold the place where I raised you, where your mother's laughter still echoes in these walls. You stripped it from me like it meant nothing. And you want my gratitude?" He looked away for a second, jaw tightening, then snapped back, eyes blazing. "It's just a house, Dad. 4 walls, a roof. You're acting like it's holy ground. You can't live alone in it anymore. You can't maintain it. I did what was practical. You don't understand, this is for the best." The strangers shifted uneasily. The woman whispered, "Maybe we should give them a minute." And they retreated further inside, leaving Daniel and me at the doorway. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything unsaid. I searched his eyes, trying to find the boy who once cried when his kite tore on the fence, who once told me he wanted to grow up to be strong like me. But the man standing here was cold, distant, a stranger carved from my own blood. "Just a house," I repeated softly, more to myself than to him. My throat tightened as I looked past him, imagining the photographs that once lined the hallway, the smell of Sunday dinners wafting from the kitchen, the quiet hum of life that made that place a home. All erased. All sold. Daniel shifted, his tone sharper now, impatient. You need to stop clinging to the past. Things change. You're old, Dad. You can't keep up. I've got my own life. And this house, your house, was holding me back. I let it go so I could move forward. I stared at him, my breath shallow. He didn't even flinch at the word he had just spoken, old, as if that excused betrayal, as if age erased the years of sacrifice that had kept a roof over his head, food on his plate, and hope in his future. The air around us seemed colder. My fingers curled against my palm, aching from the weight of all the years I carried. So, this is who you've become, I whispered. My son, who once promised he'd never forget me, now treats me like a burden to be erased. His eyes darted away, but he said nothing. And in that silence, I understood more than any words could reveal. He didn't just sell a house, he sold a part of me. He sold the life we built together. And for the first time, I wondered if the boy I raised was gone for good. But I also knew something else. There are truths written on paper, truths that cannot be erased by arrogance or betrayal. And soon, Daniel would be forced to face them. That night, lying awake in the small apartment I had kept tucked away for years, memories came back to me with the weight of a hammer striking an anvil. Sleep refused to come, and instead my mind walked through corridors of the past, retracing every sacrifice that had built the home my son now dismissed as just four walls. I remembered the long shifts when my body ached so badly I could hardly stand, yet I kept going because the mortgage payment was due. There were winters when the furnace coughed weak heat, and I wrapped Daniel in extra blankets, choosing to shiver so he could sleep in comfort. Summers when I worked in the fields by day and painted walls by night, sweat stinging my eyes, paint drying rough on my hands. I carried bricks until my back screamed, hammered nails until my knuckles bled, patched leaks in the roof while thunder rolled above me. That house was not given to me, it was carved out of bone and callus, held together by the stubborn will of a man who refused to let his child grow up without shelter. I saw my wife again in those memories, her laughter echoing in freshly painted rooms, her hands smoothing curtains she'd sewn herself. It wasn't just a building, it was the stage where our lives had played out. I could still hear Daniel's first cries bouncing off those walls, still picture his tiny hand wrapped around my finger as he toddled across the wooden floor. Every corner held a story, every nail hammered into those beams carried the sound of hope. And now, to hear him say it was nothing but wood and plaster, it was like burying her memory a second time. I closed my eyes and remembered the times Daniel himself had called it home with pride. He used to run through the front yard barefoot, chasing fireflies. He used to bring his drawings to the kitchen table, proudly announcing that one day he'd build me a house even bigger. He promised me that, with a grin full of missing teeth. Where did that boy go? When did his promises dissolve into silence, his gratitude sour into resentment? My chest ached, not from illness but from something far deeper. I had built a foundation not just of brick, but of love. And somewhere along the line, he had forgotten. Or maybe he had chosen to forget because remembering would mean facing what he had done. I sat up slowly, the old chair creaking beneath me. My hands rested on my knees, rough and scarred, proof of every sacrifice etched into my skin. They were the same hands that built that house, the same hands that raised him, the same hands that still held the documents proving it was mine. He might have sold a shell, but he could never erase the truth of what I had built. And as I stared at those hands in the dim light, I realized that Daniel hadn't just taken away my house. He had challenged my very worth as a father. That was something I could not allow to pass unanswered. The question now was not whether I could fight back. It was how and when. And fate was about to hand me the first opening. Morning broke gray and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the same weight pressing on my chest. I gathered the courage to return, thinking maybe I had misunderstood, that perhaps Daniel had spoken in anger, and would come to his senses once the night cooled his temper. With slow steps, I made my way back to the house, the bag still in my hand, though it felt like it was dragging me into the earth. When I reached the gate, I stopped. My house, my sanctuary, stood in front of me, but something felt wrong. The lawn I had trimmed every Sunday was wild, as if neglect had taken root as quickly as betrayal. The shutters were drawn, keeping out both sunlight and truth. And then I noticed them. Neighbors across the street, leaning against their fences, whispering behind half-covered mouths. Their eyes followed me, some filled with pity, others with the cruel spark of curiosity. They all knew something. Maybe they had watched the transfer of boxes, the coming and going of strangers, the quiet unraveling of my dignity. I lifted the latch of the gate and stepped inside, each crunch of gravel beneath my shoes echoing louder than it should. The door opened just as I reached it. Daniel stood there, his wife beside him, both blocking the entrance like guards. "You need to stop coming back here, Dad," he said. His voice clipped, as though he were speaking to a stubborn child. "This isn't your place anymore." I felt the sting of eyes on my back. The neighbors were still watching. I could hear the faint buzz of whispers spreading like wildfire. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to steady my voice. "You mean to tell me in front of strangers that I no longer belong in the house I built with my own hands?" Daniel's wife crossed her arms. "It's done. We signed the papers. The new owners are moving in soon. Please, don't make this harder than it already is." Her words struck me like a slap. But what broke me was Daniel's silence. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch as I stood there trembling on the doorstep. Instead, he glanced at the neighbors, then back at me with that same cold impatience. "You need to go, Dad," he repeated, softer this time but no less cruel. "There's nothing left for you here." I stood frozen, humiliation burning through me hotter than fever. The whispers behind me grew louder, but I couldn't turn around. My throat felt tight, my eyes stung, yet I forced the tears back. I would not let them see me break, not the neighbors, not Daniel, not anyone. Slowly, I bent down, picked up my bag, and stepped backward off the porch. The door closed behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. I felt dozens of eyes piercing my back, but I kept walking. Every step away from that house felt like tearing skin from flesh, like leaving behind pieces of myself scattered on the path. By the time I reached the street, I wasn't just a man without a home. I was a father stripped of his place in his own family story. What Daniel didn't know was that I still had somewhere to go, a place I had never told him about. And it was there, in the silence of forgotten rooms, that I would begin to remember who I truly was. The walk to that hidden apartment felt longer than it truly was. Each step carried the weight of memories I could not shake. The street was quieter here, away from the chatter of neighbors and the echo of slammed doors. My legs trembled beneath me, not just from weakness after the hospital, but from the hollow ache in my chest. By the time I reached the building, I had to pause, resting one hand against the cool brick wall, as though steadying myself against the world. The apartment was small, tucked away on the second floor of an aging building near the station. I had bought it years ago during better days, back when overtime shifts were plentiful and I thought a safety net was a wise thing to keep, though I never told Daniel. In my mind, it had been a quiet refuge, a place to retreat when the noise of life became too much. Now, it was all I had left. I unlocked the door, and the hinges groaned in protest, the sound of neglect filling the empty space. Dust floated in the air, catching the thin light streaming through the blinds. The place smelled of time, left untouched old wood, stale air, and a faint trace of coffee from a tin I had forgotten in the cupboard. It was not much, but it was mine. Every nail, every worn floorboard belonged to me. No signatures could erase that truth. I set my bag down by the door and lowered myself into the old recliner that waited in the corner. The cushion was stiff, but it accepted me without question. My chest rose and fell slowly as I stared at the bare walls. They did not hold photographs or memories, only silence. Yet somehow, that silence felt kinder than the words my son had spoken. Here, at least, the walls did not judge me. Here, I could still breathe. I made coffee on the small stove, the sound of water boiling filling the stillness. I poured it into a chipped mug, the warmth steadying my shaking hands. Taking that first sip, bitter and strong, I felt a strange comfort. It wasn't the comfort of family or of a house filled with laughter, but it was a reminder that I was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing for myself. As the evening settled in, I sat by the window and watched the world move on outside. People carried bags of groceries, children clung to their mothers' hands, cars rumbled past. No one knew the storm inside me, No one saw the man who had been cast out of his own home, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of betrayal. Yet in that quiet corner of the city, I realized I had not been erased completely. I still had my name, I still had my strength. And I still had proof that the house Daniel claimed was his was never his at all. The silence of that apartment whispered to me like an old friend, and soon it would carry me toward the first step in fighting back. The first night in that apartment was long. The pipes clanked with every gust of wind, and the radiator gave off more noise than heat. I barely slept, but somehow the silence of those walls gave me more peace than the house I had been driven from. Morning light crept in through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the floor. I sat at the little table with my coffee when the knock came. Slow, deliberate, familiar. When I opened the door, I found Thomas standing there, an old friend, gray at the temples now, but still with the same steady eyes I remembered from the factory floor. He carried a brown paper bag under his arm and a frown etched deep into his face. "Robert," he said softly, "I heard what happened. The neighbors talk. They say Daniel sold your house." I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The apartment seemed smaller with his presence, but his company warmed the cold air. He placed the bag on the table, pulling out a loaf of bread, some fruit, and a thermos of soup. "You've lost weight," he muttered, almost to himself. I sank into the chair, running my hand across the rough edge of the table. "It's true, Thomas. While I was in the hospital, he sold it. Just like that. Papers signed, strangers living under my roof." My voice cracked as the words left me. Thomas sat opposite me, his hand closing around the thermos but not lifting it. His eyes searched mine with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "That house wasn't just a house, Robert. You built it. Every inch of it. Your blood is in those walls." I nodded, staring into my coffee. "And yet, he treats it like it's nothing. Says I should be thankful. Says it was practical. How do you thank a son for selling your life out from under you?" The silence between us was heavy. Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you still have the papers?" I looked up, startled. "What papers?" "The deed, the mortgage receipts, anything with your name on it. Tell me you kept them." A flicker of memory stirred an old cabinet, a folder I hadn't touched in years. I leaned back, the weight of realization pressing down on me. "I think I do, tucked away. I never thought I'd need them, but—" My words trailed off, my pulse quickening. Thomas reached across the table, his hand firm on mine. "Robert, listen to me. Your son may think he's clever, but he can't sell what doesn't belong to him. If your name is still on those papers, then the truth is on your side. You just need to find it." For the first time in days, something stirred in me that wasn't grief. It was small, fragile, but undeniable hope. I rose from the chair, my knees aching, but my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. Somewhere in that forgotten apartment, among the dust and forgotten keepsakes, the answer waited. And if I was right, the very proof that could undo Daniel's betrayal was closer than I had ever imagined. I spent the rest of that afternoon pulling open drawers and lifting boxes I hadn't touched in years. Dust clung to my fingers, the smell of paper and time filling the small apartment. Thomas sat quietly in the recliner, watching, not rushing me, just letting me search through the fragments of a life I had tucked away. My heart pounded harder with each drawer I opened, as though every old receipt and yellowed photograph pulled me closer to something I both dreaded and needed to see. Finally, at the bottom of a cabinet, beneath a stack of utility bills bound together with brittle rubber bands, I found it. A worn blue folder, its corners bent, its surface faded with age. My hands shook as I pulled it free. For a moment, I just held it, staring at the scratches across its cover, memories flooding in. I had kept it safe without even realizing how important it would become. Inside was more than paper. It was my life's proof that what I had built was mine. I laid it gently on the table. The snap of the folder opening sounded louder than it should have in that silent room. One by one, I pulled out the documents. The original deed, heavy with legal wording but clear in what mattered most. My name, written firm and undeniable. Mortgage receipts, each stamped, each a testament to nights I had worked until my hands bled so the payment could be made. Tax records, property assessments, insurance papers, every line tying that house to me, not to Daniel, not to anyone else. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages. His lips tightened into a thin line, and he nodded slowly. "It's all here," he said quietly, reverently, as though he had just seen something sacred. "Robert, this is your salvation. With these, he doesn't have a leg to stand on." I traced my fingers across my own signature, faded but still legible, proof that once upon a time I had signed for more than just a roof. I had signed for my family's future, for stability, for dignity. And now, the same ink that once secured our lives would be the ink that revealed my son's betrayal for what it was. For the first time since stepping out of the hospital, my shoulders straightened. The fog of humiliation began to lift, replaced by something colder, sharper resolve. I folded the papers carefully back into the folder and pressed it against my chest. My heart steadied as though it knew the truth had finally surfaced. Thomas's voice broke the silence. "What will you do now?" I looked toward the window, the faint hum of traffic floating up from the street below. My reflection in the glass was older, worn, but no longer defeated. "I'll show him," I whispered. "I'll show Daniel who this house really belongs to." And in that moment, as the sun dipped low and shadows crept across the floor, I knew the next step was inevitable. Soon, Daniel would be forced to face not just me, but the very truth he had tried to bury. The following morning, I carried the blue folder beneath my arm like it was made of glass. Each step toward the lawyer's office felt heavier than the last, as though my body understood the weight of what I was about to set in motion. The city was already awake. Shopkeepers raising shutters, buses sighing to a stop, the smell of coffee drifting from a corner cafe. Yet around me, it all seemed distant, muted. My world had narrowed to the documents pressed against my chest and the storm they contained. Thomas walked with me, silent but steady, like an anchor. When we reached the old brick building that housed the law offices, I hesitated at the door. My reflection in the glass showed a man aged by more than years, a man bruised by betrayal, but standing anyway. I drew a slow breath and pushed inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and ink. Behind a desk sat a young receptionist. Polite smile fixed in place. She asked for my name and the purpose of my visit, her tone respectful in a way that reminded me there were still people who saw me as more than a burden. Minutes later, I was ushered into an office lined with shelves of books so tall they seemed to press the ceiling upward. Behind the desk sat Margaret Evans, a lawyer I had known in passing years ago when she helped a friend with an estate dispute. Her hair had gone silver at the edges, but her eyes were sharp and attentive. She rose to shake my hand, her grip firm. "Robert," she said kindly, "Thomas told me a little of what's happened. Why don't you sit down and tell me the rest?" I lowered myself into the chair, setting the folder on her desk with a care that made her raise an eyebrow. "This is everything," I said softly. "Every paper, every receipt, every record tying that house to me. While I was in the hospital, my son sold it without my knowledge. He says it's gone, that I don't belong there anymore." My voice faltered. "But my name is still there, isn't it?" Margaret opened the folder and began to leaf through the pages. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning signatures, dates, stamps. For several minutes, the room was filled with nothing but the rustle of paper. Then she leaned back, hands folded neatly on top of the documents. "Robert," she said firmly, "your son couldn't sell what he didn't own. The property is in your name. The sale was a fraud. These papers are more than enough to prove it." The words washed over me, a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because I was not powerless. Sorrow because I should never have needed to prove what was already mine. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the tightness in my chest ease, replaced by a steady resolve. Margaret's voice softened. "I can take this to court. I can file an injunction that freezes any transfer until the matter is resolved. If what you tell me is true, the buyers will have no choice but to confront your son. And when that happens, the truth will speak louder than any excuse he offers." I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. My fingers traced the edge of the folder as if I were touching a lifeline. For the first time since Daniel had closed the door on me, I felt the faint stirring of justice, like a flame struggling to catch. Margaret's eyes met mine. Are you ready for that confrontation, Robert? Because it's coming sooner than you think. Her words lingered in the air, heavy and certain, and I knew she was right. The day was approaching when Daniel would be forced to face the father he had cast aside, and the proof he could no longer deny. The day of the confrontation came faster than I expected. Margaret had filed the injunction, and the so-called buyers, furious at being deceived, demanded a meeting with Daniel present. It was arranged in Margaret's office, a neutral ground, but the weight of it pressed on me from the moment I woke. I put on my cleanest shirt, one my late wife had always said made me look dignified, and I carried the blue folder again, tucked close like a shield. When I walked into the office, the air was already thick with tension. The couple stood stiff near the window, their arms crossed, whispering sharp words to each other. Margaret greeted me calmly and gestured for me to sit. And then Daniel entered. He strode in with false confidence, his jacket too new, his smile too thin. For a fleeting second, his eyes met mine, but he quickly looked away. I felt something break inside me at the sight. This was my son, the boy I once held through nights of fever, the boy who clutched my hand on his first day of school. Now he carried himself like a stranger. The husband of the couple was the first to speak, his voice rising with anger. You told us everything was legal. You told us the property was in your name. Do you know the mess you've put us in? Daniel raised a hand, his tone oily, rehearsed. Calm down, please. Everything will be fine. My father doesn't understand. That was when I stood, the blue folder in my hands. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Your father understands more than you think, Daniel. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the desk. The deed, the tax records, the receipts. The truth in black and white. I looked directly at him, my eyes searching his face. Whose name is on the deed? For a moment, silence gripped the room. Daniel's jaw worked. His eyes flickered from the papers to me, then to the furious couple. His voice caught in his throat. It doesn't matter, you're too old to. Answer me, I said, louder now, my voice cracking like thunder. Whose name is on the deed? The couple leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. Margaret's gaze never left him. Daniel finally exhaled sharply, his words bitter, forced. Yours. The single word echoed in the office. My knees felt weak, but I stood taller. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I no longer felt invisible. I looked at him, my son, and said quietly, Then this house was never yours to sell. You didn't just betray me, Daniel, you betrayed the truth. The couple demanded their money back, their voices sharp and relentless, but I barely heard them. My eyes stayed on Daniel, who stood pale and cornered, his mask of confidence crumbling. In that moment, I saw the weight of his choices begin to crush him. And though part of me ached to reach out, to remind him that I was still his father, another part knew this was only the beginning, because the world outside those walls would soon hear what had happened, and there would be no place left for him to hide. News spreads quickly in a neighborhood where every window is a watchtower. By the time I walked back through the streets near my house, it seemed every porch light burned a little brighter, every curtain twitched with curious eyes. Whispers carried like smoke in the air. Some spoke softly with pity. Poor Robert, after all he's been through. While others had a sharper edge, delighting in the scandal. Imagine selling his father's house while the man was in a hospital bed. I kept my head down, but I felt every glance press into me. I was no longer invisible. My humiliation, my son's betrayal, it had become public property. And yet, strangely, there was something different this time. The stares were not all filled with scorn. Some carried respect, the kind that rises when truth begins to surface. I walked slower, letting them see me. Let them whisper. Let them measure the difference between the father who worked and the son who schemed. That evening, I sat on the bench by the corner store, a place where I had once waited for Daniel to come home from school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Back then, neighbors would smile at me, ask about my boy, say he was lucky to have such a father. Now, as the whispers floated down the street, I wondered if those same voices would still speak his name with pride. Margaret had told me to prepare myself, that public opinion would turn like the tide once the truth came out. I hadn't expected it to sting this much, hearing the gossip swirl in real time. He sold the house, his own father's, someone murmured near the bakery. I heard the papers weren't even in his name, another added. I closed my eyes, hearing Daniel's voice in my memory. The coldness in it? Asterisk. It's just a house, Dad. Asterisk. But the neighbors knew it was more. They could see what he had done. And it was their whispers that began to strip away the shield he had built around himself. By the next morning, the shame had reached him. I saw Daniel on the porch when I returned to the street, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the clusters of neighbors gathered like shadows at the fence. They did not greet him, they did not wave. Their silence was louder than gossip. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering something sharp, but Daniel kept staring at the ground. For the first time since he had shut the door in my face, I saw cracks forming in his armor. His arrogance faltered under the weight of a community's judgment. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine across the street. There was no warmth in his stare, only the restless flicker of a man cornered not by fists, but by truth. And in that moment, as the whispers grew into something heavier than words, I understood that his battle was no longer just with me. It was with the very air he breathed, the eyes that watched him, the respect that was slipping through his fingers like sand. But the storm was not finished yet, because soon we would sit across from each other in Margaret's office again, not just father and son, but adversaries bound by the truth of a deed he could not erase. The office felt colder that morning. Though the sun poured through the tall windows in golden streams, I sat at the long table with Margaret by my side, the blue folder open in front of us like a weapon laid bare. Every document sat neatly in order, each one a fragment of truth waiting to cut through lies. I could hear my own breathing, slow and heavy, while Margaret's calm presence steadied me. She adjusted her glasses, her voice even as she reminded me, "Stay firm, Robert. You don't need to raise your voice. The papers will speak for you." The door opened, and Daniel walked in with his wife trailing close behind. His face was pale, his eyes restless, but he forced a smile as though this were some casual meeting between family. He carried no folder, no stack of proof, only his words, which already felt flimsy compared to the papers spread before me. Behind him came the couple he had tricked, the so-called buyers, faces hard with anger. The room filled quickly, each person dragging their own silence into it. Margaret motioned for everyone to sit. The air was thick, a mixture of paper and tension, like the moments before a storm breaks. She began simply, her voice crisp and deliberate. "This meeting is to clarify ownership of the property located on Pinewood Lane. Mr. Robert is the documented owner. The attempted sale was not valid." The words landed like stones. The buyers immediately turned to Daniel, their voices sharp. "You told us it was yours to sell. You said your father had given it up." Their accusations struck him harder than I could. I watched as he flinched, his hands clenching on the table, his voice rising in protest. "My father doesn't understand," he said quickly, trying to wave the papers away. "He's old. He's confused. He can't manage property anymore. I was just taking care of it." The words stung, but I kept my eyes on him. Slowly, deliberately, I leaned forward, my hand resting on the deed Margaret had placed at the center of the table. My voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the weight of every sleepless night and every sacrifice I had ever made. "Confused or not, Daniel, my name is on this deed. Not yours, not hers, mine. You cannot sell what you never owned." His face tightened, anger and fear colliding. He opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret cut him off with a sharpness that left no room for defiance. "Your father is correct. Unless you can provide legal documentation proving otherwise, this matter is closed. What you attempted, Mr. Daniel, is fraud, and if the buyers wish, they may pursue criminal charges." The couple shifted, whispering furiously to each other, their fury burning hot in the small room. Daniel's wife tugged at his sleeve, but he shook her off, his voice cracking now. "You don't understand. I needed this. We needed this." His words collapsed in the air, hollow and desperate. I looked at him then, really looked at him, And what I saw was not the confident man who had thrown me out of my own house. What I saw was a boy trapped in his own lies, cornered by the very truth he had tried to bury. I wanted to feel pity, but what filled me instead was something colder. The knowledge that this battle had only just begun. And as the meeting broke apart, voices raised, papers gathered, and Daniel stormed from the room with his wife at his heels. I knew the storm inside him was only growing. What I did not know was how far he would go when rage finally drowned out reason. When Daniel stormed out of Margaret's office that day, his footsteps echoed down the hall like gunshots. I followed behind slowly, my legs heavy, while Margaret gathered the documents and slipped them neatly back into the blue folder. Outside on the street, the air was sharp with winter chill, and people passed us without knowing that a father and son had just drawn a line that could never be erased. I caught up with him near the corner, where his wife tried to soothe him with hushed words. He pulled away, his face red with fury. When he turned on me, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, not just anger, but desperation laced with resentment. "You've ruined everything," he spat, his voice cracking. "Do you know how much I counted on that money? Do you have any idea the plans I made?" I held the folder tighter against my chest, steadying my voice even as my heart thundered. "Plans built on lies will always collapse, Daniel. You tried to take what was never yours." He stepped closer, his jaw trembling. His voice rose, carrying across the street for anyone to hear. "You're old. You don't need a house. You don't even need money anymore. You should be grateful I was trying to do something with it, instead of letting it rot in your hands." The words hit me harder than the cold wind. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. My son, my own flesh, stood there telling me my years of sacrifice were worthless, that my age made me disposable. I drew in a long breath, the ache in my chest heavier than the folder in my arms. "It was never just a house, Daniel. It was your childhood. It was your mother's memory. It was everything we built together when I worked until my body broke just to keep food on the table. And you think all of that can be sold for a handful of bills?" His face twisted. For a flicker of a second, I thought I saw regret in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He slammed his fist against the brick wall of the building, the sound startling a passerby. His wife tugged at his sleeve again, whispering that people were staring, but he shook her off. "I don't care about the past," he shouted. "All I care about is moving forward. And you're nothing but an anchor around my neck." The words cut through me like ice. My throat tightened, but I swallowed the pain, refusing to let him see me falter. Around us, the world carried on, cars rolled by. A child laughed from across the street. A man sold roasted peanuts from a cart, but in that moment it felt like the world had stopped, leaving just the two of us locked in a battle of blood and betrayal. I turned away before my voice could crack, before my knees could give out. "One day, Daniel," I said softly, almost to myself, "you'll understand that respect cannot be bought or sold. But by then, it may be too late." He didn't answer. His rage trembled in the air long after I walked away, and I knew that fury would not fade. It would fester, growing into something far more dangerous than I could yet see. And as I held the folder close and headed back toward my small apartment, I understood that this was no longer just a family dispute. It was a fire, and Daniel's anger was about to set everything in its path ablaze. The buyers did not stay silent for long. 2 evenings after that confrontation, I heard a heavy knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, there they stood, Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, the couple Daniel had deceived. Their faces were pale with fury, their eyes hard as stone. They hadn't come for conversation. They had come for answers. "Mr. Robert," Mrs. Callahan said, her voice shaking though she held it sharp, "we need to understand what kind of family we've been dragged into. Your son took our money. He looked us in the eye and told us it was his house. We trusted him, and now we're left with nothing but shame and a contract worth less than the paper it's written on." I stepped aside and let them in. The small apartment felt even smaller with their anger filling the room. They sat stiffly at the table, their hands clenched together as though holding back the urge to break something. I poured coffee out of habit, though none of us touched it. Mr. Callahan leaned forward, his voice low but full of threat. "We could go to the police. We could file charges tomorrow and drag his name through the mud. But before we do, I want to hear from you. Did you know? Did you let him do this?" The question stung. I straightened in my chair, meeting his eyes. I didn't know, I said firmly. While I lay in a hospital bed, my son signed papers he had no right to sign. He used my absence as an opportunity. I never gave him that house, never gave him the right to sell it. The husband exhaled, shaking his head, fury still etched into every line of his face. He's ruined us. Do you understand? That money was our savings, our future. We trusted your family. Guilt burned in my chest, though the crime wasn't mine. I cannot undo what he did, I said softly. But I can promise you the truth is already moving against him. Margaret, my lawyer, has filed the injunction. The courts will see his fraud for what it is. He cannot hide behind my name anymore. Mrs. Callahan's eyes softened for a moment, though anger still simmered beneath. Do you even realize what this means for him? For your son? He could lose everything, his reputation, his job, maybe his freedom. I lowered my gaze, the words like stones in my stomach. He already lost something far greater, I murmured. He lost me. And that's a debt no court can forgive. For a while, none of us spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the silence, steady and relentless. At last, Mr. Callahan rose, his hands pressed flat against the table. Then we'll let the law handle him. But understand this, Robert, your son has made enemies. And enemies don't forget. When they left, the apartment fell quiet again. I sat in the chair, staring at the untouched cups of coffee, their steam long gone cold. My heart ached with a father's sorrow, but beneath it a harder truth grew stronger. Daniel's world was unraveling, thread by thread, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the anger of others collided with the rage already burning inside him. Sleep came in fragments after the Callahans left. Their words echoed in my head long into the night, their fury mixing with the image of Daniel's face when the truth had cornered him. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the radiator rattle, and somewhere between waking and dreaming, my mind pulled me back to a memory I had buried deep. It was many years ago when Daniel was still a boy with scraped knees and wide eyes. We sat on the porch after dinner, the summer air heavy with the sound of crickets. I had just come home from a 12-hour shift, my hands blistered, my back sore. Daniel leaned against me, chewing on a piece of bread I had saved for him. He looked up at me suddenly and asked, "Dad, why do you work so hard? Isn't there an easier way to get money?" I remember pausing, wiping the sweat from my brow, and staring out at the yard. The moonlight caught the edges of the fence I had built plank by plank. I told him slowly, choosing each word as if it were a nail driven into wood. Because easy money doesn't last, son. It burns fast and leaves you with nothing but ashes. Greed eats everything in its path, even family. Promise me you'll never let it eat you. He nodded back then, though his young eyes were restless. I promise, Dad, he said, his small hand resting on mine. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But even that night, I saw the flicker of curiosity in his eyes, the dangerous sparkle that wondered if maybe there was a shortcut. The memory shifted, years later, when he was older and restless. He came home one evening with friends whose laughter was too loud, their pockets jingling with coins they hadn't earned. I confronted him, told him to stay away from quick schemes, from men who lived off deception. He rolled his eyes, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it before. You're just afraid of living big, Dad. You settle for scraps when there's a feast out there. You'll die poor, and I don't want to end up the same. Those words cut me back then, but I told myself he was just young, just angry, just searching. I warned him again. Greed doesn't make men rich. It makes them hollow. One day, you'll see. Now, sitting in my dim apartment with the blue folder at my side, the memory weighed on me heavier than the documents. I realized that Daniel hadn't stumbled into betrayal by accident. The hunger had been growing inside him all along. I had seen it, and I had hoped my words could change him. But hope wasn't enough. I rubbed my tired eyes, the silence of the room pressing in. The warning I had given him so long ago had become prophecy. He had let greed eat away at everything: respect, honesty, even blood. And now, it was no longer just me who would hold him accountable. The next step was already unfolding, and soon, The place where truth would be tested would not be a porch or a lawyer's office, it would be a courtroom. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, the kind of scent that lingers in places where lives are rewritten. I arrived early that morning, the blue folder clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Margaret walked beside me, steady and composed, her heels tapping firmly across the marble floor. My heart thudded in my chest as though it wanted to turn back, but my legs carried me forward. This was no longer just about walls or bricks. It was about dignity, about truth, about the years of sacrifice that could not be erased with a forged signature. Inside the courtroom, people shuffled into benches, their whispers low but sharp. Neighbors, acquaintances, curious strangers. Word had spread faster than fire. I sat at the plaintiff's table, feeling their eyes press against my back. Daniel entered a few minutes later, dressed in a suit that looked too new for him, too polished, as if he thought clothes could cover the cracks in his story. His wife trailed close behind, her eyes hard, her lips pressed tight. When Daniel's gaze met mine across the room, he quickly looked away, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled more than he realized. The judge, a man with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, called the room to order. Margaret rose first, her voice calm but firm, presenting the folder. One by one, she laid out the documents, the deed, the tax receipts. The mortgage records her words, weaving them into a story of sweat, sacrifice, and undeniable ownership. This house, she said, her hand resting gently on the stack of papers, was never Daniel's to sell. The evidence is irrefutable. It belongs to Robert, and it always has. Then Daniel's lawyer spoke, his tone slick, almost mocking. He painted me as an old man confused by age, clinging to the past, incapable of managing property or money. My client, he said, gesturing toward Daniel, was simply protecting his father from responsibilities he can no longer carry. His words slithered through the courtroom, but I saw the judge's frown deepen. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. Your Honor, I began, my throat tight but steady. This isn't just about ownership, it's about respect. I built that house with these hands. Every board, every nail, every late payment scraped together from long shifts. It was where I raised my son, where his mother laughed, where we lived our lives. To have it sold behind my back while I lay in a hospital bed, that is not protection. That is betrayal. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering something urgent in his ear. The buyers, seated behind him, looked at him with a mix of fury and contempt. And the judge, expression unreadable, scribbled notes with slow precision. When the gavel struck to end the day's proceedings, the tension in the room lingered, heavy and unresolved. The decision had not yet been spoken, but I could feel it building, like a storm gathering strength. As I walked out of the courtroom, the blue folder still pressed against my chest, I knew one thing with certainty. The truth was louder than any lie Daniel could tell, and soon, he would learn just how loud it could be. The courthouse felt different on the day of the verdict. The air was heavier, thicker, as though even the walls were holding their breath. I sat at the front with Margaret beside me, her calm presence steadying the storm that churned inside my chest. The blue folder rested on the table, though by now it was no longer just a bundle of papers, it was my life's testimony. Every sleepless night, every scar on my hands, every tear shed in silence lived within those pages. Daniel entered moments later, his steps slower than before. The suit he wore now seemed to hang awkwardly on him, the fabric wrinkled, as if it too had grown tired of the charade. His eyes darted around the room, catching the stares of neighbors and townsfolk who had gathered, their curiosity sharpened into judgment. He didn't meet my gaze. Perhaps he couldn't. The judge appeared, robes flowing as he took his seat. The gavel's crack silenced the murmurs instantly. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears as the judge began to speak. His voice was deliberate, steady, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. After reviewing the evidence presented, he said, lifting the deed from the stack of documents, "It is the judgment of this court that the rightful owner of the property is Mr. Robert." His eyes flicked toward me for a brief second before continuing. The attempted sale of the house was fraudulent. The deed, the tax records, and the testimony provided leave no doubt. The property shall remain in Robert's name. Any funds exchanged in this false transaction must be returned to the buyers, and the matter of criminal responsibility will proceed separately. The words settled over me slowly, like a blanket after a long winter chill. My shoulders sagged, relief and sorrow tangling together in my chest. I had won, but victory had never felt so heavy. Behind me, whispers swelled. The Callahans exchanged a look of grim satisfaction, their anger now directed fully at Daniel. I glanced at my son then. His face had drained of color, his lips pressed tight, his eyes burning with something between shame and rage. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked smaller, like the boy I once scolded for breaking a neighbor's window and hiding behind excuses. But there was no hiding now. The truth stood taller than him. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the gavel's final strike echo through me. Justice had spoken. Yet even as the weight of the decision lifted, a hollowness remained. The house was mine again, yes. But the son I had raised, the boy who once clung to my hand on stormy nights, felt lost to me forever. When the judge dismissed us, I rose slowly, clutching the folder once more. Margaret whispered, "It's done, Robert. You can go home now." But as I stepped out into the cold air beyond the courthouse doors, I realized home was no longer just a house. Home was a truth I had fought for, and a bond broken beyond repair. And though the battle was over in the eyes of the law, I knew the war within my family was far from finished. Because soon, Daniel would come knocking again, but not with arrogance this time. With desperation. The courthouse emptied slowly, footsteps echoing in the wide marble hall as families and strangers drifted away. I lingered on the steps outside, my hand resting against the railing, the blue folder pressed once again to my chest. The verdict had been spoken. The house was mine beyond question. Yet the victory felt hollow. The cold air brushed against my face, and for a moment I stood there, watching people scatter back into their lives, wishing I could do the same. The walk back toward Pinewood Lane was long. I moved slowly, my legs stiff, my heart heavier than it had been in years. The whispers followed me, not cruel this time, but murmurs of respect. A neighbor tipped his hat as I passed. Another gave me a nod, her eyes soft with sympathy. They knew the truth now. They knew whose name had endured, whose labor had built that home. And yet, each step closer filled me with both pride and grief. The house came into view as the sun dipped low, painting the street in amber light. For a moment I simply stood at the gate, staring. The yard was overgrown, weeds pushing up where flowers once bloomed. The shutters hung unevenly, the front door scuffed and weathered. My house had aged without me, but it was still mine. My name, my blood, still lived in its foundation. I opened the gate, its hinges creaking, and stepped onto the path. Neighbors stood at their porches, watching silently. I felt their eyes follow me, not with mockery this time, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as though they were witnessing not just a man reclaiming a home, but a father reclaiming his dignity. I placed my key into the lock. It turned with a stiff resistance, the sound of metal against metal striking something deep inside me. When the door opened, the smell of dust and stale air greeted me. The rooms were empty now, furniture gone, curtains stripped, walls bare. Every corner felt like a ghost of what it once was. Still, I stepped inside, my shoes echoing against the wooden floor. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, letting my fingers trace the grooves I had once patched, the edges I had once painted. Memories rose up like smoke, my wife humming while setting the table, Daniel chasing a ball across the hallway, laughter spilling into the kitchen. All of it lingered here, invisible but alive. Yet in that silence, something else pressed in. Loneliness. I had won back the house, but the family it once sheltered was broken. The echoes were all I had left. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the living room, the folder resting beside me, and for a long while I simply listened to the stillness. Outside, the world carried on, children shouting, dogs barking, the rumble of cars, but inside, the house and I shared the same silence. A silence both comforting and cruel. As twilight deepened, I realized this was only a pause, not an ending. Because I knew, as certain as night follows day, that Daniel would come back. He would not come with pride or arrogance this time. He would come with desperation. And when that knock finally came, I would have to decide whether to open the door. It was just after dawn when the knock came. I had dozed off in the armchair, the blue folder still resting on the small table beside me, when the sound rattled through the quiet house. At first I thought it was the wind against the shutters, but then it came again, 3 steady knocks, each one carrying a weight I already knew. My heart sank before I even rose to my feet. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there. His suit was gone, replaced by rumpled clothes that looked slept in. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, his shoulders slumped as though the verdict had taken every ounce of pride from him. For a moment, he simply stared at me, his lips parting without sound. Then, finally, the words fell out like stones. "Dad, please." The silence between us was heavy. I studied his face, searching for the boy I once knew, the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who cried when he lost his first dog, who once promised he'd take care of me when I was old. But standing here now was not that boy. This was a man broken by his own choices. I stepped aside just enough for him to enter, though I said nothing. He crossed the threshold hesitantly, like a guest uncertain of his welcome. He sat at the edge of the chair, his hands clasped together, shaking. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he confessed, his voice hoarse. "The buyers want their money back. People won't talk to me. They look at me like I'm poison. I can't go to work. My boss told me to take time off. Everything is falling apart." His eyes lifted to mine, wet and desperate. "I need your help." I sank into the armchair across from him, my hands folded tightly to keep them from trembling. His words cut deep, but not in the way they once did. There was no arrogance now, no cold dismissal. Just a son stripped bare by consequences he had thought would never catch him. "Help," I repeated quietly. "After you locked me out of my own home, after you told me I was too old to matter, after you sold the very roof your mother and I built with our own hands. Now you want help?" He lowered his head, shame painting his face. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I see that now. I thought I could build something better for myself, but I destroyed everything instead. I don't know how to fix it." The sound of his voice, breaking like a child's, pulled at something deep within me. For all his sins, he was still my son. Blood does not dissolve, even when trust shatters. Yet forgiveness is not something given lightly, not after a wound cut this deep. I leaned forward, my voice low, heavy with sorrow. "Daniel, I can't decide today if I'll open this house to you again. A roof means nothing if there's no respect under it. You threw me out once. You'll have to prove you won't do it again." He looked up, his eyes searching mine for mercy. But all I could offer in that moment was truth. The house was mine, the dignity restored. But the question that lingered was heavier than any verdict. Could a father's heart ever mend enough to let his son back in? Daniel sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the answers he sought might be hiding in the grain of the wood. The house felt colder with him inside, as if the walls themselves remembered what he had done. I studied him, the rise and fall of his shoulders, the tremor in his hands. For years I had dreamed of hearing my son admit his wrongs, imagine what it might feel like if he ever said the words I needed to hear. Yet now that he sat here, stripped of pride, begging for mercy, the weight of it pressed heavier on my chest than I expected. I thought of his childhood, the nights I worked myself to the bone so he would never go hungry, the mornings I packed his lunch before heading to the factory, the way he once clung to me when storms rattled the roof. Those memories lived in these walls, and they lived in me still. But beside them now sat the memory of the day he sold this house, the day he called me old, useless, dead weight. Some wounds do not close simply because tears fall. "Dad," he whispered, finally raising his head. His eyes glistened, voice cracking like dry wood. "I can't lose you. Not you. I've lost everything else." The words pierced me. For a heartbeat, I wanted to gather him into my arms, to tell him that fathers forgive, that love survives even the cruelest betrayals. But another part of me, the part that had stood alone at this very doorway, humiliated and cast aside, held me still. Love without respect is only weakness. I rose slowly from the chair, my knees stiff, and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood stirred with life children racing on bicycles, neighbors exchanging morning greetings. The world kept moving, indifferent to the storm that raged between father and son inside these walls. I rested my hand on the cool glass, watching the street I had walked for decades. Without turning, I spoke. Daniel, houses can be sold, money can be stolen, but dignity is not yours to take from me. You tried, and you failed. What happens now between us will not be decided by court papers or neighbors' whispers. It will be decided by whether you can respect me as the father who gave you life. Behind me, I heard him choke back a sob, but I did not look. Some words must settle in silence before they find their place. I turned finally, walking to the door, and opened it wide. My voice was calm, though my heart trembled. You may come back one day, Daniel, but not as a man begging for what you squandered. You will come back as a son who finally understands what it means to honor his father. The door creaked on its hinges, the light spilling in from outside. Daniel stood, uncertain, tears wetting his cheeks. He hesitated, searching my face for permission, for something more than I was ready to give. And then I let the silence speak for me. Because sometimes the strongest answer a father can give is not yes or no, but the quiet reminder that respect must be earned, not demanded. As he stepped toward the threshold, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of his choices, I knew this story was not yet finished. For though I had reclaimed my house, the question of whether I had lost my son forever still lingered like a shadow across the floorboards.